This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by democracy at work. One of the difficulties of doing political work in the United States is the fierceness of the anti-Marxism. And it is simply, this is a hangover, if you like, of the McCarthyism period. And it's a hangover that has never gone away. And Walter Rodney, in one of his essays, talked about this. And he wrote as follows. I thought that it was very interesting. He says, one knows Marx is absurd without reading it. And one does not read it because one knows it is absurd. Therefore, he continues, one glories in one's own ignorance because it is fashionable in the United States to glorify that state of ignorance, so that when, for example, Donald Trump loves to go on about how the socialists and the communists and the cultural Marxists have taken over the Democratic Party. When he says that, of course, there are certain people who immediately jump and kind of say, yeah, we have to stop those people because they're evil people. And this was, of course, the McCarthy tradition. But then for those of us who are kind of working a bit with Marx, then this kind of question of the hostility and the glorification of ignorance about Marx, while at the same time absolutely accepting that it is absurd. This is a really kind of difficult problem. In my own experience, and I'm going to largely talk about that, I didn't read Marx until I was, 35 years old. And I started reading Marx then because I was finding all of the other formats of social science were not really adequate very much to what was going on. This was at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. And so, in conversations of this sort with a couple of faculty and some graduate students, we decided we would read Marx. And so we sat down and tried to read Marx collectively, about a dozen of us. And it was very interesting. We spent the whole year, really working very hard on Volume 1 of Capital. And at the end of the year, we sat around and we looked at each other and we all basically said, we really don't understand this stuff. So we better do it again. So we did it another year. And the second time around, we really began to understand it really well, and it became very exciting. And after that, I started to teach it because I thought it was very interesting. And I occasionally would reference it in articles I was writing and all the rest of it. And what was very, very strange was I had only referenced it about 3 times without it being totally critical. Then I suddenly found myself described as a Marxist. Now, I didn't call myself a Marxist, and I didn't think of myself as a Marxist. I just was interested in understanding the world, and I just found Marx was extremely helpful in understanding certain basic things that were going on around me in the city of Baltimore, and particularly in the transformations going on through deindustrialization and all the rest of it. So I switched into that way. And after a bit, I would say, no, I'm not a Marxist. I just think Marx is interesting. And I think you should be prepared to. But what I was encountering was, of course, the residual of McCarthyism. And to mention Marx in a positive light is immediately, therefore, to go beyond the pale. And therefore, one is depicted as absurd. And I found myself actually in my profession of geography being effectively dismissed as absurd. And I couldn't get my articles published in the regular journals. So, and there were other people on the left as well, and we were all finding the same problem. So we had to set up our own journal, which was a journal called Antipode or Antipode, depending upon how you want to pronounce that. So we then had an outlet where we could start to write articles about what we wanted to do and use Marx in it. But essentially, Antipode was regarded as a renegade journal. And then later on, it was kind of said, well, basically it wasn't a serious journal, and therefore it was not really an academic journal because it was not, it was all about political opinion, and it wasn't about, quote, objective science. So the objective scientists in geography spent a lot of time saying that we were not only absurd, but we were just giving vent to political opinions. My response to that was to try to write in such a way. And this is where, if you like, the tactical thing starts to become important. I started to write in such a way as to show that this was not absurd, that in fact it was a very serious form of argument, a very logical argument, very well structured argument, and I started to sort of really work extremely hard at that. And in order to persuade people that this way of thinking was not, by definition, absurd. Of course, there are absurd aspects of it, and as there always are, and some absurd renditions of it, which there always are. But the absurdity was very minor compared to a lot of the absurdity that existed in the conventional practices. Now, at this point, people would kind of say, "Well, what's your answer?" And I had to give a personal answer in terms of my own life. Many people kind of said, "Look, academia is totally absurd." They went against it, forcefully, kind of proclaiming that academia was all ideology and pretended to be scientific when it was really totally unscientific. Well, the trouble was that when people did that, they lost their jobs, and so I started to watch people falling out of academia. And I think I formulated the idea very early on that one of the things to try to do was to try to create a body of work which would, if you like, protect a space inside the discipline of geography or beyond that in sociology and elsewhere, protect a space in which one could freely discuss the ideas of Marx and socialism and all the rest of it, and actually seriously set up counter proposals. Now, academia is a peculiar labor process, a very peculiar kind of situation where, on the one hand, there's constant pressure to try to conform, but on the other hand, there's also a kind of an insistence that innovation is fundamental and foundational for the perpetuation of a capitalist society, and this innovation, while it does concentrate very much upon science and engineering and biology and all the rest of it, that innovation around social questions also becomes terribly significant, so that it becomes hard to discipline academia. And for that reason, the possibility of keeping a space open for progressive analyses and for teaching Marx and all the rest of it is a real possibility. But do not imagine that it is easy. You kind of find that a lot of universities have gone very corporatist these days, and they want to know exactly how much you're going to earn in terms of research grants and all the rest of it. And this was kind of the way it was set up. I mean, and I took the view that the university was there and it was a job, but I was going to try to actually, to some degree, subvert that job by starting to fill it with some sort of content, which was progressive and which was Marxist. In order to do this, however, I thought that it was important to engage in some little games of subversion. And one of the ways in which I did that was I had some courses which I was giving, and I was giving them in ordinary kind of terms. That is, I was not sort of inserting too much about Marx and Marxism into those courses. So what I did was that I taught an extra class. So I did my duty, as it were, by teaching the course load that I was supposed to teach. But then I would add one, which was a freebie, and I would say, if somebody came along and said, "Hey, you weren't hired to do that," I say, "Oh well, I was hired to do this other stuff, and I'm doing that other stuff. That's okay." And so this was a very real problem, and the problem was to try to play this game of subversion outside. I took the class off campus to some degree. I taught it in the Progressive Action Center, and the like. So this became a real possibility. So the teaching of Marx then was running against the grain. It is still the case that it's actually very difficult to find, good courses on Marx taught in many university settings. Many people could go through university and get a degree in sociology or in social science without actually taking a serious course on Marx. Of course, Marx will be mentioned, but usually it's mentioned in 10 minutes and they will read something from one of Marx's writings, and that would be it. So this was a kind of conventional way of handling things. So how to bring Marx into the mainstream is a real challenge, and I've been struggling most of my life to do that. And I think it's extremely interesting that to this day I have never really been able to get any kind of reaction from mainstream media, mainstream discussions at all. I've tried to write an op-ed piece occasionally for the New York Times, always dismissed. Anything with that's Marx or Marxism is immediately dismissed in the mainstream media. I never will get anywhere at all. Now, this is kind of a little strange because, and here I'm afraid I'm going to have to assert some bragging rights, because I did do what I said I was going to do in the early 1970s onwards, which is to try to create a literature which was significant. And it's not just me, but others were also creating a literature. And we created, if you like, a whole corpus of literature which affected geography, not only affected geography, but it also affected disciplines like sociology and political science and all the rest of it, anthropology. It certainly influenced them. So we did work very hard at that. And I would always say to my graduate students, look, I hope you're being as political activist as you like. But the one thing you have to do for me is you have to produce a body of work which, if somebody challenges it and says it's not serious, I can take that work and say, look, this is serious work. So you've got to be able to do the serious work, and you probably have to be twice as good as almost everybody else in order to get a job and to get yourself, well established in academia. And many of them have done that and have done extremely well at it. But nevertheless, it involves a sort of dialogue, if you like, between what's going on in the terms of the rules of the game of academic life and the rules of the game in certain disciplines, and how those rules can be challenged, subverted, bypassed, or something like that, so that we always have a space in which to discuss those issues which are critical to us. But this is not, like I said, it's not an easy thing. Because the constant pressure is to try to sort of say things like, well, in your department, you need to go out and get grant money. And I had Dean say to me, you need to go and find grant money, and you need to get, finance for your own students and all the rest of it. And I would say things like, "Well, you mean to say to me that I should try and set up an Institute of Marxist Studies funded by General Motors or something like that?" And I actually, the dean looked at me and when I said that, and he said, "Yeah, I think that's a good idea," he said. So I kind of think, well, this is kind of a hopeless thing because essentially, academia has become a money-making set of institutions. They want to make as much money as they can by getting grants and all the rest of it. A lot of the grant money now comes from corporations. The corporations are certainly not going to fund the kind of research that I would want to do. So we have this thing. And alongside of that is that our work, while it is well established now in academia and well established to a very considerable degree, it will never go into the mainstream. Like I mentioned, the New York Times would never publish anything I've written because it's by, quote, a Marxist. I will not get on one of the channel news because, quote, I'm a Marxist. And this is what Walter Rodney's talking about when he said this ferocious anti-Marxism is something which is kind of very, very hard to confront. And in my own case, I gauge some bragging rights now. I mean, there are these indices of citations and so on, and I have over 320,000 citations, far more than almost everybody else in much of the social sciences. If you did a citation kind of index in the social sciences, and these have come out, you find that I'm on the sociology index, I'm on the economics index, and so on, because I get a lot of attention. So it's not as if my work is unknown. In fact, my work is pretty widespread, and people refer to it a lot. Not always positively, of course. A lot of the citations are very negative, saying that I'm absurd and an idiot for saying certain things. So yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, you would have thought that in this country that academics with the kind of citations and indexes and so on that has been achieved by not only me but by others working in this field would command a certain kind of attention in the mainstream media. But the answer is no. There's a ceiling there in which what's called repressive tolerance operates. That these medias, these groups like MSNBC and so on, and other groups of that sort, they all kind of like to think they're liberal and open and all the rest of it. But they are very much characterized by what's called repressive tolerance. That is, they're tolerant and really talk about their tolerance all of the time, but there are certain walls beyond which you cannot go. And one of the walls you cannot go beyond is one in which you actually would embrace Marxism and you would embrace what Marx had to say. And I'm still involved in this battle, if you like, to try to make Marx more comprehensible, more available for the mass of the population by writing the companions and engaging in the collective teaching and so on. So there is it, but it's a perpetual battle. And at the same time, there are things going on in terms of academic understandings, which even within the field of Marxism are a bit troubling. Let me close, if you like, with this. Every 5 years or so, somebody comes up with an idea that we should put an adjective in front of capital. So instead of talking about the theory of capital, we talk about the theory of cognitive capital, or we talk of the theory of surveillance capital, or we think of biopolitical capital or something of this kind. In other words, there's a tendency amongst academics to try to come and define the next great thing which is coming down the pike. And the next great thing, which has just emerged, is this idea that we're going, capital is pedaling backwards into feudalism. That we're beginning to get the sort of a reconstructed feudalism, which is technocratic. It's a technocratic feudalism, and to be sure, there are certain features of feudalism, such as debt peonage, which seems to me to be very much on the agenda right now. I mean, the indebtedness around the world, but the kind of indebtedness that exists right now is radically different from the debt peonage that existed in feudal times. So this debate, which has suddenly arisen about, are we going back to kind of a feudal structure, is, I think, a little. It's a bit like the cognitive capitalism and all the rest of it. It's a sort of giddy thing that people are working with, but that does not mean that capital is not in the full flood of serious change. If there is a comparison to feudal times, I would go back to say, well, actually, for me, one of the things that is very important right now is to recognize that the structure of capital has been changing away from a market-based society to a sort of a regulated capital corporatist sort of social order, which is a little bit different from the kind of standard model of how capital works from Adam Smith through Marx up to the sort of neoliberal, neoclassical formulations of recent times. So what am I doing here? I want to say, well, okay, there may be some fun kind of things where we can look at what happened in feudalism and say, well, are there parallels? For instance, one of the things that I always found fascinating in reading Ferdinand Braudel, who was one of the originators of world system theory. Well, Braudel kind of character whose main work was actually as an economic historian of the late medievalism and the Mediterranean and all the rest of it. Well, Braudel kind of at certain points kind of said, well, if you want to understand the structure of feudal society, you might actually think of it in terms of three layers. The bottom layer, if you like, in the basement and the ground floor, is daily life of a peasant society, which could be serf or it could be independent peasantry and so on. But daily life is such that they grow their crops, they have their thing, they have limited kind of money, they buy very little in the market, but certain important things they can get from the market, such as implements and equipment and so on. But daily life is essentially fairly static and has been static for the last 500 years, says Braudel. And, wars and fights and religious persecutions and so on can wash over this society, but the basic everyday character of that society remains fairly unchanged. Okay, there are some important innovations during this period, like gunpowder and printing press and so on. But a lot of that is taken up with military activities and all the rest of it, rather than daily life and in the peasant feudal world. The second layer, says Braudel, is the layer of the market. And the market is where, commodities are exchanged, peddlers take goods from here and there. And the market actually does have a very global spread. I mean, even at that time, spices were coming from the Far East. True, North America was not integrated into the machine until after 1492. But the market is vibrant, and, certain people are taking wool supplies from Britain to Flanders or from Britain to the Italian states, and the Italian states are sending beautiful woven cloth and items of that sort back to the courts and to the feudal houses of feudal lords and so on. So the market is there. There's even an organization of the market, actually, in the terms of the Hanseatic League, where merchants in the various uh, ports around the Baltic and around the North Sea, down into the Bay of Biscay, had a sort of relationship with each other. So the Hanseatic merchants would be in London, they would be in Hamburg, they would be in Rotterdam, they would be in Amsterdam. They would be on small areas like Gotland in the middle of the Baltic Sea. They would be even stretching as far as St. Petersburg. So the Hanseatic League was a sort of trading organization, and commodities were moving over space in that league. It connected to the Mediterranean circulation processes, which were bringing the spices and all the rest of it from the Orient, and the trade that went on in the Hanseatic League was was of timber and salt. Salt was terribly important, actually. Wine and all the rest of it. So if Henry VIII was got in his cups and got completely drunk on wine, it was coming from Bordeaux and places like that. In fact, the English at a certain point conquered part of that part because it was supplying so much wine to England. So the market then is fluid, and it's developing, and it's extensive over space. It is transformative to certain degrees. But then, says Brodel, you come to what's going on in the attic. And the attic, he says, is the place where the capitalists play. Now, this is a curious definition of capital, because he's saying basically in the attic, you get the real big players, the guys who had huge, and it was guys, huge amounts of monetary power, the initial bankers and the like, and those who kind of organized cities. So they were organizing the city-states like Venice and Genoa and so on, and later on Amsterdam and Bruges and so on. So these are the big players, and these are the big, if you like, monopolists. These are the people who operate above the market. Now, it's an interesting conception of that, because operating above the market, outside of the market, and yet being called capitalists. So Brodel calls them capitalists of the period. They're the big name people who eventually morphed into the Rothschilds and the like. So these capitalists were therefore not constrained by the market at all. Their relations were transactional between each other, and they played around in the market, and they tried to compete with each other to some degree by competing for influence, for hegemonic position, if you like, within the whole kind of structure of state powers and interstate systems as it was emerging during that time. So Brodel sort of talks about this. There's daily life, there's the market, and then there's the big players in the superstructure. Well, right now, it's kind of interesting to me, particularly that last bit of formulation, because a lot of capital now is so big, so enormous, so powerful, that it's not constrained by the market at all. I don't see Amazon being constrained by the market. Essentially, Amazon is a monopoly power. I don't see Apple that way, and it's not hard to see that these players in the upper market, like Elon Musk and so on, can do all kinds of things. They can go spend $40 billion on this and borrow $40 billion to do that. Soros can do this. So what we have right now is a rather different structure to capital, to that which was coming into being during Marx's years, which was much more competitive capital between different producers producing similar items. And we now have a much stronger tendency towards monopoly. Now, in some respects, monopoly capital as a concept was around, of course, when Lenin was writing, and it was revived very much in the 1960s. But monopoly capital was really about oligopoly, about General Motors and and Ford and Chrysler being the big three auto manufacturers. And during the 1960s, there was no foreign competition. They were simply competing amongst each other, and the three big auto companies were, in effect, an oligopoly. And it produced a whole kind of theory of monopoly capital at the hands of people like Baran and Sweezy, whose books on the monopoly of monopoly capital, I think, were still worthwhile studying to this day, because they talk about a particular situation. What they didn't recognize, because they tended to take a kind of teleological view of kind of saying, well, once monopoly capital is established, you can't break it down. But what, of course, happened was, with neoliberalism and globalization, the oligopoly that was there in the 1960s was effectively broken by the time you get to the 1980s, because the big three in Detroit are now in competition with the West German automobile industries and with the Japanese automobile industry, and gradually after that, of course, the Koreans and the Chinese and everybody else got into the game. And these forms of industry sort of swamped, if you like, the European sectors of Renault and the like, and many of them had many of the big American firms had branch plants. For instance, General Motors had branch plants in Germany in World War II. So, interestingly, the General Motors plant did not get bombed in World War II. It came out of it pretty much intact. And you wonder about the targeting that was going on there, and whether that there was some sort of favoritism towards General Motors in that. But General Motors was active with branch plants in Germany. Ford had some in Britain, and of course in Argentina there was an industry there at the time, of Brazil too. So the monopoly power was always there in the 1960s, but to some degree it was broken up through the increasing international competition during the 1980s and 1990s. Well, now it's returned, if you like, to the oligopoly kind of structure, and particularly in pharmaceutical products, particularly in energy, the oil companies, the big seven, and all the rest of it. So in effect, you would kind of say the coercive laws of competition have limited influence upon these very huge corporations, which are very, very powerful, both in terms of the actual marketplace, but also in terms of their command over money, resources, and also, of course, their political command. So so that right now it would indeed seem to me that it is worthwhile suggesting that capital is moving into a different phase, and it's a different phase in which the yin and yang, if you like, between monopoly and competition, which favored competition in the 1980s, is now favoring monopoly power. And the state is, of course, doing very little or nothing to prevent that. And in fact, the state is increasingly, if you like, the vehicle whereby monopoly power is consolidated. So that, yes, indeed, there is something new going on in the world, but I don't think it's helped by kind of saying this is a reversion to Braudelian structure, or it's a reversion to feudalism and so on. Because when you do that, immediately people start to ask, well, what theory of feudalism are you talking about? So you then get back into all of the arguments that were had about feudalism sort of, 20, 30 years ago. And we find ourselves, fussing around with things like that. What we need to do right now is to have an understanding of what is happening in terms of our current situation. And the current situation is if it's dominated by anything, it is a scalar leap. We are now dealing with corporations of such enormous scale and such enormous power that this is something which is qualitatively different from the way capital was organized in, say, in the 1960s or 1970s. We went through neoliberalism, I think we're now coming out of neoliberalism through this command and control structure. And not so long ago, Alfred Chandler wrote an interesting book, which was called The Visible Hand. And one of the things that Chandler did was to trace historically, saying, everybody likes to talk about the hidden hand of Adam Smith and suggest that the evolution of capital was about the laws of motion of capital and the operation of the hidden hand within those laws of motion. Everybody likes to talk about that. But he said, well, even from the 1920s onwards, you start to see the visible hand of the corporations, that the corporations started to, if you like, not exactly rule the world. But if you were kind of into, in the 1970s, if you looked at telecommunications in Chile, you would see ITT. You would see a lot of the agribusiness firms, Monsanto and so on, very much working through the Green Revolution. So you would start to see a far greater presence of the visible hand of the corporations in terms of what is happening politically and what is happening economically. Right now, I think that it's not the visible hand of the corporation so much as the actual power of the investors. That is, it's the bondholders. And this has led out some people to kind of say, well, that's like giving power to the rentiers, the people who just control the money and who are just going to live off the proceeds of that money without actually making anything or doing anything. And that is, of course, a rentier situation is a bit akin to some of the things that occurred in feudal period. But there's no point in calling it feudal capitalism. It's really no point. What it is a point about is to say, look, we have to understand the revival of rentierism, which is the power of the bondholders. We've got to understand the power of the big corporations and how that power is being exercised right now. And therefore, instead of thinking about a pure capitalist society, which is being driven by laws of motion through coercive laws of competition, we should be looking more closely at what is actually happening on the ground in terms of the organization of capital. And capital is now operating at scales which make it very difficult to see how to change it. This is where, of course, the whole question of, well, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? There is a different story to be told, it seems to me, about political organization, which is prepared to go head to head with the big corporations, as opposed to the kinds of things which are local and can provide, if you like, the ferment in the base for political activism. But at a certain point, we have to be able to scale it up, or it has to be able to scale itself up in such a way that it can confront the enormous corporate power that now exists and the ways in which that corporate power actually depend upon certain forms of human behavior, so that there is a certain kind of human consequence of the modes of communication of accumulation which now exist. And this has nothing to do with feudalism and has nothing to do with recreation of any of that. It has something new to say about the world as it is becoming right now. One final point I would want to make about this. I lived through the neoliberal revolution, which began sometime in the 1970s with roots way, way back. At the time, I didn't know how to call it. I didn't call it the neoliberal revolution. I didn't call it neoliberalism till almost 30 years later. And we're going through something right now, and we don't know how to name it. And I've said this before, but I say it again. We have to think about its qualities and recognize its qualities for what they are, not try to stuff it into some sort of preconceived idea about, oh, this is a return to this or return to that. This is a new situation, a new configuration, and it's a new configuration where answers are not easily had given the institutional structures. For example, climate change cannot be addressed by states that are openly in competition with each other. It cannot be addressed under corporate power configurations, which are hostile entirely to anything that threatens their own interests. So if you take those two layers, corporate power and bondholder power, if you like, on one side, the interstate competitive system on the other, both of those institutions are totally inimical to anything being done seriously about global warming. And that means that the global warming question is going to actually swamp us far, far harder in the future. And it's only when we recognize that we have to change that institutional structure entirely in order to confront the global change issue that we're really going to get somewhere. So that, again, is something which is a theoretical understanding and a practical understanding. And the kind of practical politics that are involved in that are way beyond what I can imagine. But it's something that we need to collectively contemplate and collectively think about.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production.